This story, the real one, doesn't begin with the reading of my father's will. That's where the drama started, sure, but the roots of this whole mess, the seeds of the betrayal that would bloom into a full-blown family war, were planted years before, in the dry, unforgiving dust of our inherited land. They were planted when my brother David first tasted real power, and I, his younger sibling, learned what it meant to be consistently overlooked. We grew up on that sprawling, sun-baked acreage, land that looked worthless to outsiders, but to us, it was everything. It held the ghosts of our ancestors, the scent of parched earth after a rare rain, and the promise of a future my father always insisted would be bright. A future we now had to divide. My father, a man of quiet strength and ancient secrets, passed away 6 months ago. His last days were peaceful, spent staring out at the hazy horizon, never once mentioning the coming storm that his will would unleash. He left the land, all 1,500 acres of it, split equally between David and me, 50-50. It seemed fair, straightforward, the kind of solution a simple good man would choose. But David wasn't a simple man, not anymore. He had left the farm 10 years prior, gone to the city, and became what my father, bless his heart, never quite understood, a speculator. David didn't see soil, he saw potential development. He didn't see the old oak my mother used to read under. He saw the future site of a low-density housing estate. The day the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, read out the division, David's face hardened. He'd expected the whole thing. He'd always acted like the heir apparent, the one who deserved the bulk of the estate because he had the business acumen to handle it. I, the quiet one, the one who stayed behind and actually helped my father tend to the failing crops and the aging machinery, was apparently nothing more than an obstacle, a sentimental nuisance standing in the way of his multi-million-dollar vision. I remember the exact moment he dropped the facade of grief and the corporate shark emerged. We were standing in the dust-filled living room, the deed lying on the antique mahogany table, heavy with history. David didn't even wait for Mr. Henderson to leave. "This is a joke, isn't it?" David's voice, usually smooth and modulated, was razor-sharp. 50%? What are you going to do with your half, Alex? Try to grow organic kale and sell it at a roadside stand? He actually sneered. I felt that familiar, hot flush of indignation I'd felt 1,000 times growing up whenever David dismissed my dreams. "It's what Dad wanted, David," I replied, keeping my voice level, focusing on the legal document, not the man. "It's in the will. It's fair." "Fair?" He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Fair is recognizing talent and opportunity. I have investors, Alex. I have a proposal already drafted for a major development company. Your half sits right in the middle of phase 1. You'd tank the entire deal, not to mention the value of my share, just to cling to some romantic notion of our childhood." He leaned in, his eyes narrowed, calculating. "I'm giving you a chance to cash out now. I'll buy your share. $10,000 an acre. Take it or leave it. It's generous, considering the real value of this barren scrubland. $10,000 an acre. It sounded like a fortune to a man like me who had lived frugally his whole life. It would set me up for life, but something in his absolute certainty, his arrogant demand, made my gut clench. He was offering a lot, yes, but he was demanding everything. He didn't ask, he ordered. And I knew deep down that David never offered anything unless he was getting a multiple of that value back. His greed, transparent and familiar, was the first concrete turning point of this whole ordeal. "I'm not selling," I said, and the words, once spoken, felt like steel. I saw the surprise, then the fury flash across his face. "Don't be an idiot, Alex. It's an easy out. You have no idea what it takes to manage a property this size, especially one that's primed for development. You'll be dealing with surveyors, zoning restrictions, endless paperwork, and trust me, I'll make sure you hit every roadblock imaginable." He was threatening me, his own brother, over our father's legacy. But he was operating on old information, the Alex he remembered, the compliant, easily intimidated little brother. He didn't realize that in the last 2 years of my father's life, a crucial, secret transformation had taken place. It started subtly. My father, frail and reflective, had started telling me stories. Not the typical back-in-my-day yarns, but specific technical details about the land. He spoke of the old-timers, the way they survived the droughts of the 1950s, not just by praying for rain, but by finding water where others said there was none. He'd bring me to obscure spots, overgrown with thorny bushes, and point out subtle dips in the ground, variations in the color of the soil. "The land always speaks, son," he'd whisper, his hand trembling as he traced lines on the dirt. "You just have to learn its language." He'd been hinting at something deeper than just agricultural knowledge, but I couldn't quite grasp it. Then, 3 months before his passing, he gave me a gift, a tarnished, leather-bound journal that looked like it had survived a war. It wasn't his diary, it was my grandfather's. Tucked inside the last page, secured by an old brittle paperclip, was a piece of parchment. It was faded, fragile, covered in handwritten annotations, compass directions, and cryptic symbols drawn in sepia ink. It looked like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. It was the original survey map of the property, but unlike the official government documents, this one had additional, crucial markings. My father had looked me straight in the eye the last time he ever had that kind of clarity, and said, "This is the real inheritance, Alex. Not the land itself, but the knowledge of what it holds. David only sees the surface. You, my son, must look deeper. Keep this secret. Don't show David, not yet. He wouldn't understand the responsibility that comes with this kind of wealth." He called it the source map. The map of the water springs. That map, which I had carefully scanned, digitized, and cross-referenced with modern GPS coordinates, wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a blueprint to true wealth, the kind that superseded property development and speculative ventures, reliable subterranean water sources in a region increasingly plagued by drought. My father and his father before him had meticulously charted the major perennial underground aquifers that crisscrossed our property, sources so deep and powerful they could sustain not just a farm, but an entire community, or, more importantly for David's perspective, a massive self-sufficient development that didn't rely on the cripplingly expensive, unreliable municipal supply. The value of this information wasn't $10,000 an acre. It was exponential. It was the difference between a high-risk, low-profit development and a guaranteed gold mine. When David stood before me, demanding my 50% share and promising to crush me with bureaucracy, he was acting on the assumption that the land's only value was its location and size, relying on the public records that showed the land as semi-arid and water-stressed. He didn't know that I had the source map rolled up in my fireproof safe. He didn't know that I was holding the key to a resource worth more than all his city slicker contacts combined. This knowledge wasn't just my defense, it was my ultimate leverage. And as his face twisted in annoyance, believing I was simply being sentimental, I realized I had to play the role of the naive brother just a little longer. I had to let him overplay his hand. "It's not for sale, David," I repeated, picking up my copy of the will. "I'm keeping my half. If you want to develop your half, go ahead. But my boundary line is non-negotiable." I turned to walk away, but his next words stopped me cold. "Then I'll take it by force, Alex. I've already started the legal proceedings to force a partition sale. It's too large an area to be practically divided, and I have the capital to outbid you. You won't see a dime of what I offered you. You'll be lucky to walk away with enough to buy a small apartment in the city." This wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. He was going to use the law, his lawyers, and his massive financial advantage to strip me of my inheritance. He thought he had me checkmated. He was wrong. The game hadn't even started. He hadn't accounted for the water. David's legal maneuver, the forced partition sale, was the predictable opening move of a man who viewed every problem as a nail requiring his corporate hammer. He filed the petition 2 weeks later. The documents arrived via a grim-faced process server right as I was patching a leaky irrigation hose, a fitting contrast between my simple reality and David's complex predatory machinations. The suit argued that the land, while geographically split 50-50, was not practically divisible for its highest and best use, which, according to David's expensive lawyer, was residential development. Therefore, a forced auction was necessary, where the highest bidder, which he naturally assumed would be him, would buy out the entire parcel. It was textbook power play, designed to exhaust my limited funds and force me to capitulate. My immediate problem was that his legal argument had merit, at least on the surface. Our land was a large, contiguous rectangle. Splitting it down the middle would create two long, narrow properties, making access and utility hookups needlessly complicated, especially for a large-scale housing project. The court was likely to side with the argument for consolidated sale, which meant I needed to establish a compelling counter-narrative of practical divisibility, and fast. The problem was, I couldn't yet reveal my secret weapon, the source map. To show the map now would be like showing a full house before the final card is dealt. David would simply adjust his strategy, incorporate the water value into his current offer, and continue the legal siege. I needed to let him commit to his low valuation, to the narrative that the land was dry, worthless scrub. So, I had to be smart. I hired the most aggressive, dirt-cheap lawyer I could find, a grizzled, semi-retired man named Arthur, who specialized in small-town property disputes and had a deep, almost spiritual dislike for big city money. Arthur's strategy was simple: delay and obstruct. He filed motions challenging the jurisdiction, the appraisal, and even the font used on David's initial filing. It bought me 2 critical months. 2 months I didn't spend consulting geologists or engineers. I spent it reading my grandfather's journal, poring over the faded parchment, and, crucially, spending every waking hour on my half of the property, not trying to farm, but trying to understand the water. The journal was a marvel of pre-modern engineering and patient observation. Grandfather hadn't used seismic surveys. He used dowsing rods, the migratory paths of specific birds, the slight cooling of the air at dusk, and the peculiar growth patterns of hardy desert shrubs. He had marked 3 major spring areas on his map. 2 were shallow and seasonal, perfect for old-fashioned farming. But David already knew about those. They were public knowledge. The 3rd, however, was marked with a different symbol, a stylized double helix, labeled simply, the deep source. It was located right on the property line, a line David wanted to erase. And according to grandfather's precise, meticulous directions, the source was not a spring, but the access point to a massive, underlying underground river. Following the coordinates, which I had laboriously converted from magnetic north bearings and paces to modern latitude and longitude, led me to the far southeast corner of the property, a remote area where the land sloped sharply into a dry ravine. It was entirely covered by a dense, suffocating thicket of mesquite and thorn bushes. The perfect cover. I spent days cutting through the vegetation, sweating in the oppressive heat, feeling more like an archaeologist than a landowner. And there, exactly where the map indicated, I found it. A circle of stones, almost perfectly camouflaged, surrounding a narrow, hand-dug well shaft, capped by a rusty, impossibly heavy cast-iron lid. This was not the common, wide, cemented well type. This was a discreet access point, a hidden tap. My heart hammered against my ribs. David and his surveyors had driven past this spot a dozen times, dismissing it as just another overgrown ravine. Now, the true, exhilarating revelation. The deep source, according to grandfather's notes, was so deep that a modern submersible pump would be required, but it guaranteed a flow rate of over 100,000 gallons per day, year-round, regardless of drought conditions. This wasn't just a water source. It was an inexhaustible utility provider. Any developer would value that source at tens of millions of dollars, transforming the semi-arid scrubland appraisal into prime, self-sufficient, low-risk development. The key to the inheritance wasn't just the land, it was the ability to deliver water. Armed with this evidence, I made a calculated risk. I didn't tell Arthur about the map. Instead, I instructed him to shift the focus of our legal defense. David was arguing that the land was only valuable as one unit for residential use. I told Arthur to argue that the land was not valuable for residential use at all, but rather for resource extraction and specialization. I told him to commission an unofficial report from an eccentric, low-profile hydrologist, someone who didn't charge much but was known for finding water where others failed. I paid the man $500 to conduct a preliminary, non-invasive ground analysis only on my half of the property, avoiding the exact spot of the deep source. The hydrologist's report came back exactly as I'd hoped. Ambiguous, but suggestive. It hinted at strong anomalies in the subsurface, suggesting potential for specialized, high-yield infrastructure. I instructed Arthur to file this as an exhibit, arguing that my half of the land held a specialized, non-residential value, maybe minerals, maybe geothermal energy, we didn't specify, that made its division perfectly practical. David's lawyers scoffed. They labeled the report speculative drivel and accused me of fabricating evidence to stall the auction. David himself called me, furious, demanding I stop wasting his time and money. "You're pathetic, Alex," he hissed over the phone. "You're grasping at straws. Minerals? On that rock? Just take the money, you fool. I'm raising my offer to $11,000 an acre just to save us both the legal fees. What do you say? Last chance." This was the second major turning point. He was escalating, growing impatient, but he was still operating entirely in the dark. He truly believed his increased offer was a massive win for me. He was betting everything on the public records showing dry, cheap land. He was so focused on the surface, the property lines, the zoning, the quick flip, that he missed the most vital detail. He didn't know I had already hired a small, discreet drilling team, not for water, but for a simple deep soil test near the deep source access point. This was my final preparation. I was gathering hard scientific data to back up my ancestors' map, ensuring that when the time came to reveal the truth, it would be undeniable, legally and geologically. I needed to move from defense to offense, and the upcoming court-mandated mediation was the perfect arena. "The answer is no, David," I said, my voice calm, the confidence not in the bluff, but in the map I held. "I look forward to seeing you at the mediation, and tell your lawyers to bring a bigger checkbook. You're going to need it." He hung up with a sound that was pure, frustrated rage. I smiled for the first time in months. He had just raised the stakes, and in doing so, he had walked right into the trap baited with 100,000 gallons of water a day. The court-mandated mediation session felt less like an attempt at resolution and more like a legal ambush. It took place in a sterile, windowless conference room in the city, a place designed to make men like me, men who smelled of sun and soil, feel out of place and outmaneuvered. David arrived in a tailored suit, flanked by two lawyers who looked equally expensive and bored. I had Arthur wearing a tweed jacket that was at least 30 years old, reeking faintly of pipe tobacco and righteous indignation. The mediator, a weary judge named Ms. Davies, had clearly reviewed David's aggressive filings and saw me as the stubborn holdout delaying an inevitable, sensible partition sale. David wasted no time. He laid out charts and graphs detailing his proposed multi-phase development, the estimated revenue, and the disruption caused by my insistence on holding on to a half-share that served no logical purpose. His lead counsel, a sharp woman named Ms. Kinsley, delivered a rehearsed monologue about market efficiency, citing case law that favored unified sales for optimal resource utilization. They were selling a vision of progress, and I was the sentimental relic standing in the way of millions. "We are offering Mr. Alex $11,000 an acre, a 10% premium over the highest appraised value for this arid land," Ms. Kinsley concluded, resting her hands on the table with an air of finality. "This generous offer expires at the close of this session. If Mr. Alex rejects it, we proceed with the partition sale. Our client, Mr. David, has secured the financing necessary to bid up to $30 million on the entire parcel. Mr. Alex simply cannot compete." The message was clear: take the money or be crushed. I expected Arthur to counter with another motion to delay, but I had prepared him for this moment. I gave him a single small stack of papers, the results from the deep soil test I had secretly commissioned, the one disguised as a simple geological survey. The report was technically accurate. It detailed the deep, specific composition of the soil layers in the far southeast corner of my property. It made no mention of water, only soil density, rock stratification, and mineral traces. Arthur cleared his throat, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "Ms. Davies' counsel, you've heard Mr. David's assertion that the highest and best use of this land is residential development. We disagree. We submit that Mr. Alex's half has a specialized, non-residential utility that is severely undervalued by current appraisals, and that makes the land practically and economically divisible. David scoffed. Here we go again with the speculative drivel, he muttered. Arthur ignored him, presenting the soil analysis. This report indicates the unique geological strata on the eastern half of the property, specifically concerning the unusually high concentration of bentonite clay at the 150-foot mark, and a rare composition of high-grade potash at 300 feet. The room fell silent. Bentonite clay and potash. Both are highly valuable industrial minerals. Bentonite is used in drilling and construction, and potash is essential for high-yield commercial fertilizers. Neither had been expected in that arid, overlooked corner of the county. The faces of David's lawyers shifted instantly from boredom to genuine professional alarm. They hadn't surveyed that deep. They hadn't needed to. They were looking for flat land for foundations, not deep mineral deposits. David, however, was still dismissing it. That's junk science, a low-ball attempt to inflate the appraisal. We need independent verification. Independent verification has been secured, Arthur replied smoothly, pulling out a second, slightly heavier folder. This was my trump card for this phase. We have an agreement, signed and notarized last week, with the Western Mineral Group, a mid-sized exploration firm. They have offered a $5 million exploration rights lease and an escalating royalty structure on any bentonite or potash extracted from Mr. Alex's half of the property. The lease is contingent on Mr. Alex retaining ownership of his 50% share. $5 million, just for the right to look for minerals. The number hit the table like a physical weight. Ms. Davies sat up straighter. David's jaw dropped. The total appraised value of the entire 1,500-acre parcel before this was around $15 million. Suddenly, my 750 acres had a guaranteed immediate value of $5 million, not counting future royalties, all contingent on the land not being sold at auction. The forced partition sale, which relied on the argument of the land's unified highest and best use, was now deeply undermined. The court could no longer easily dismiss the land as one uniform residential plot. This was the brilliant, calculated third turning point. I didn't have to lie. The soil report was real, the lease offer from the Western Mineral Group, who were simply interested in the geological data I provided, was real. But the bentonite and potash were nothing compared to the true prize. The minerals were simply the misdirection, the shiny object to distract David and his team from the real value hidden just 40 feet below the mineral layers, the deep source. David recovered his composure, though his eyes were narrowed with a toxic mix of panic and renewed greed. It's a stunt, Alex, a predatory lease. I'll make a better offer right now. I'll buy your share for $10 million cash. You walk away clean. That's double the current appraised value for your half. Ms. Davies looked at me, urging me with her eyes to take the deal. $10 million was a life-changing sum. It was enough to settle me comfortably forever. I shook my head, my gaze locked on David. No, David, it's not about the money anymore. It's about Dad's legacy and the simple fact that you tried to steal it from me. Then, I delivered the final, crippling blow for this phase, the one that put David truly on the defensive. Furthermore, Ms. Davies, if Mr. David proceeds with the partition sale and buys the whole property, my legal team will immediately file a countersuit against his development company for tortious interference and a clear water rights claim. The existence of these documented high-value geological resources on my half means that his planned residential development, which relies on a uniform appraisal and unified use, is fundamentally flawed. We will argue that his attempts to force a sale are deliberate acts of bad faith designed to acquire an industrial resource at a residential price. The lawyers' faces were white. A water rights claim, even a threatened one, could halt any major development project for years. But the twist was this: the water rights claim I was threatening to make wasn't based on the secret deep source. It was based on the fact that any deep drilling for bentonite or potash could accidentally tap into the deep source aquifer. I was using the mineral lie to protect the water truth. David, now realizing he might be buying an expensive legal quagmire, not a housing development, looked physically sick. The mediation ended abruptly, not with a sale, but with a temporary injunction against David's partition sale petition. He had failed. He was defeated for now, but I knew his greed wouldn't allow him to back down. He was going to send his own experts next. He was going to dig. And that, I realized, was exactly what I needed him to do. David's reaction to the mediation failure was exactly as calculated. Pure, focused paranoia. He couldn't risk the $5 million mineral lease being real, nor could he afford the years of litigation a water rights claim would ignite. He knew I didn't have the funds to actually mine the potash or bentonite, but he also knew that the Western Mineral Group's offer was a massive, non-negotiable hurdle. The forced sale was blocked, and now he had to find out what I really had. I fully anticipated his next move. He would dispatch his own specialists to conduct an aggressive, intrusive survey of my half of the land. This was the moment I had been planning for, the moment I needed David's experts to look exactly where I wanted them to look, and yet miss the one thing that mattered. My job now was to manage the optics. I needed to look like a small-time operator frantically preparing for a big industrial venture, drawing all attention to the mineral claim. I spent the next 2 weeks implementing a series of theatrical, but ultimately superficial changes on my property. I used part of the money from the initial mineral lease deposit to rent heavy machinery, a backhoe and a small front loader. I dug a few shallow, conspicuous test pits near the site Arthur had highlighted to the court, making sure they were clearly visible from the main access road and the air. I even hired 2 old friends to walk the perimeter in reflective vests, carrying clipboards, making them look like low-level project managers. It was all a carefully choreographed smokescreen. The goal of the spectacle was to reinforce the bentonite and potash narrative. I wanted David's team to confirm the mineral deposits and feel confident that they had found the real secret, the one I had been hiding. This would prevent them from wasting time on a comprehensive water survey, which, though difficult and expensive, might eventually turn up evidence of the deep source aquifer. I needed them to conclude definitively that the land's specialized value was mineral-based, not water-based. A week later, David's crew arrived. It wasn't subtle. 2 expensive, climate-controlled SUVs, a flatbed truck hauling sophisticated seismic testing equipment, and a drone buzzing overhead. The lead man, a severe khaki-clad geologist named Dr. Thorne, approached my boundary line with a disdainful air. I met him there, playing the role of the overwhelmed, slightly out-of-his-depth farmer struggling to manage a massive industrial pivot. "Mr. Alex," Dr. Thorne stated, his voice clipped and professional, "we are here under court agreement to verify the geological claims you've made. We require full access to the eastern parcel for non-invasive exploratory work." "Sure, Dr. Thorne," I replied, gesturing vaguely toward the freshly dug, shallow pits. "Just be careful around the test sites. We've got core samples down there that the Western Mineral Group is very keen on." Dr. Thorne didn't bother to hide his contempt. He ordered his team to ignore my test pits and focus their seismic analysis on the deep structure, looking for the telltale signatures of the thick bentonite and potash layers that Arthur had filed in court. For 3 days, the land vibrated with the low thrum of their equipment. The drone maps confirmed the geological structure Arthur had claimed was present, indicating the deep, layered deposits. I knew this was true. The mineral deposits did exist. My grandfather had even noted them in his journal as secondary wealth. But the presence of those specific layers was also the reason why nobody had ever bothered to look for water. Everyone assumed those dense, specific mineral layers meant no significant, accessible water table. On the 3rd afternoon, Dr. Thorne approached me again, looking smug. "Your claims are exaggerated, Mr. Alex. We've verified the presence of the geological strata that could yield industrial clay and potash, but the volume and quality are marginal, certainly not justifying a $5 million lease. It's a speculative gamble at best, a clever legal ruse at worst. We'll be submitting our findings to the court. The highest and best use of this property is still consolidated residential development." He thought he had cracked the case. He had found the secret and determined it was a weak bluff. He thought he knew everything. "Did you find any water, doctor?" I asked innocently. He scoffed. "Water? No. The deep mineral layers and the general arid conditions preclude any sustainable potable surface aquifer. Any water you find is too shallow and seasonal for anything other than basic irrigation. This land is dry, Mr. Alex. That was the pivotal, thrilling moment of confirmation. David's best expert, using the most advanced equipment, had looked at the deep source map, the mineral composition, and had, according to scientific doctrine, ruled out the existence of the reliable, high-yield subterranean water. He had looked, and he had been blinded by the decoy I set. He found exactly what I wanted him to find, a geological feature that simultaneously justified my legal claims and reinforced the narrative of aridity. As David's team packed up, I put the final part of my plan into action. I hiked out to the dry ravine in the far corner, the location of the deep source, the one spot David's team had never bothered to survey because it was too rugged and geologically irrelevant for residential or industrial digging. I removed the heavy cast iron lid and, using a small specialized sensor, confirmed the water level was exactly where Grandfather's journal said it would be. I then used the remaining funds I had saved to hire a discreet water testing laboratory, sending the sample in via a third party under a fictitious name. I needed undeniable scientific proof of the water's purity and flow rate. David was about to win the battle of the minerals, but he was about to lose the war for the water. I had let him walk away convinced the land was dry, and that mistake, I knew, would cost him his entire fortune. The next court date was set for the final, decisive hearing. I was ready to play my ultimate hand. The final court hearing was not mediation. It was a judgment. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with the weight of millions of dollars and the collapse of a family bond. David, buoyed by Dr. Thorne's report, was radiating confidence, an icy, triumphant glee that made my stomach turn. He had, in his mind, outmaneuvered my pathetic mineral stunt. His lawyers filed a motion based on the geologist's findings, arguing that the mineral deposits were too marginal to justify a divided property, and that the original petition for a forced partition sale must proceed. David was preparing for his final bid. Arthur, for his part, looked grim. He had played the mineral card as expertly as possible, but the technical evidence, while enough to stall David, wasn't strong enough to halt the sale permanently. I pulled him aside just before the session began, handing him a thin, official-looking envelope, sealed and stamped with a lab logo from 3 states away. It contained the final water purity and flow analysis report. "This is the real evidence, Arthur," I whispered. "Don't open it until I give you the nod. It changes everything." He looked at me, a flicker of suspicion in his weary eyes, but he trusted me enough to place the envelope on the desk, carefully positioned beneath his worn legal pad. The session began with Ms. Kinsley presenting Dr. Thorne's findings, tearing apart the valuation of the bentonite and potash. "The mineral claims were a smokescreen, Your Honor," she stated, addressing the judge directly. "A desperate attempt by Mr. Alex to inflate the land's value and obstruct the rightful, efficient sale of the property. The evidence clearly shows that the land's highest and best use is unified residential development. We request the court immediately authorize the partition auction." The judge, stern and impatient, turned to us. "Mr. Arthur, what is your counter-argument? Do you have any new, compelling evidence to justify the continued division of this land?" Arthur, as instructed, started with a strategic concession. "Your Honor, we acknowledge the findings regarding the industrial minerals. Perhaps my client overestimated the immediate value of the potash and bentonite. However, our initial argument was about specialized utility, and that remains our core defense." He paused, looking at me. This was the moment, the final, irreversible turning point. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur lifted the sealed envelope, his hand steady. "Your Honor, Mr. Alex's half of the property, the eastern parcel, contains a resource far more valuable, far more specialized, and far more vital to this arid region than any mere housing development. A resource whose discovery renders any notion of a forced sale under the current valuation, especially one based on aridity, an act of legal fraud." He broke the seal and spread the documents out on the desk, sliding copies to the judge and the opposing counsel. "This is the analysis from the Southern Geohydrology Institute. It confirms the location and quality of what we are calling the deep source aquifer, located exclusively on Mr. Alex's 750 acres. Ms. Kinsley, David's lawyer, grabbed the report first. She scanned the document, and her face went from professional composure to utter shock. Her eyes darted from the flow rate analysis, a staggering 110,000 gallons per day, far exceeding municipal capacity, to the purity analysis, grade A potable water, requiring minimal treatment. This was not a bluff. This was scientifically verified fact. Then David got his hands on the report. He read the numbers, his brow furrowed in disbelief, then his eyes flickered up, meeting mine. In that moment, the entire history of our conflict, the sibling rivalry, the greed, the arrogance, was condensed into a single, terrifying realization for him. He understood immediately what this meant. He hadn't just tried to buy land, he had tried to buy the water rights for a future city, and he had dismissed them as worthless. "This is fabricated!" David shouted, leaping to his feet, ignoring the judge's gavel. "It's a forgery! Dr. Thorne's report found no deep water. It's impossible!" The judge slammed the gavel down. "Mr. David, control yourself. Mr. Arthur, how do you explain the contradiction with Dr. Thorne's report?" Arthur stood tall, pointing a finger directly at Ms. Kinsley's defense table. "Dr. Thorne's report, Your Honor, was entirely accurate. He found the deep layers of bentonite and potash, and based on established geological doctrine, correctly concluded that those layers preclude a conventional, shallow aquifer. What Dr. Thorne failed to realize, Your Honor, is that the geological structure on this property is unique. The source map, passed down from my client's grandfather, indicates a massive, confined artesian aquifer beneath those mineral layers, fed from a deep, pressurized fissure system miles away." He pulled out the final piece of paper, the map. Not the whole fragile parchment, but a clean, modern overlay, showing the deep source location, the bentonite layers, and the precise, narrow well shaft I had unearthed. "This is a utility, Your Honor. The value of Mr. Alex's land is not its surface area for residential housing, nor its marginal mineral content. Its true value is as an independent, year-round water utility provider. The capital investment required to acquire and develop water sources of this magnitude on a property intended for residential use is astronomical. To force the sale of a property containing an industrial-grade resource under the guise of eliminating a sentimental nuisance is not the highest and best use. It is a clear attempt at unjust enrichment." The judge didn't look at David. She looked at the reports, the flow rates, the purity level. The argument was airtight. The court could not, in good conscience, force the sale of a specialized public utility asset simply because the other party wanted to build houses on adjacent, water-starved land. The forced partition sale was denied, but the victory wasn't complete until I delivered the final, crushing sentence. I stood up, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I am willing to settle this matter permanently. I will sell my half of the land to Mr. David for one agreed-upon price. But since the value of this property is no longer $10,000 an acre or even $10 million, I will accept an offer that truly reflects the value of the unique resource found on my land. I will sell my 750 acres, including all water rights to the deep source, for $75 million." The number hung in the air, a devastating figure. David went pale, collapsing back into his chair. $75 million. That was the price of his greed, the cost of dismissing his brother and assuming the land was worthless. That was the market value of water in an arid environment. He demanded my share for a pittance. He didn't know I was selling him the whole damn river. The silence that followed my $75 million offer was thick enough to choke on. David, slumped in his chair, looked like a man who had seen his entire financial future vaporized in an instant. His lawyers, professional to the end, immediately huddled, whispering frantically. Ms. Kinsley, regaining her composure, addressed the judge, her voice strained. "Your Honor, that figure is egregious. It is an extortionate valuation based on a single, isolated report." The judge, however, was already consulting with her clerk, clearly impressed by the gravity of the water analysis. "The court cannot mandate a price, counsel, but the court must acknowledge the substantial and specialized value demonstrated by the petitioner, Mr. Alex. The petition for partition sale is permanently denied. Mr. David, You are welcome to make a counteroffer, or you can proceed with the development of your own 50% parcel, acknowledging that Mr. Alex's 750 acres and the associated water rights are fully independent and not subject to eminent domain for your private enterprise. The ruling was a total victory for me. David was stuck. He couldn't force the sale. He couldn't develop his half into a multi-phase housing project without a guaranteed massive water supply, and the only reliable source was now sitting squarely beneath my control. His investors, who were watching this whole debacle closely, would pull out the moment they heard he had no water security. His entire dream, his 10 years of city slicker maneuvering, hinged on acquiring the deep source. David finally looked at me, and there was no greed left in his eyes, only a hollow, incandescent hatred mixed with absolute, dawning despair. 75 million, Alex, he finally spat out, the words ragged. You know I can't liquidate that kind of capital in a week. You're trying to ruin me. You started this, David, I replied, my voice calm, the resolution finally settling over me. You tried to ruin me for $10,000 an acre. You threatened to crush me in court. You forgot that Dad always said the only true wealth in this valley is water, and you forgot that he gave me the map. I didn't need to elaborate. The mention of the map, the true inheritance, was enough. He understood then that this wasn't just a financial transaction. It was the final defining act of sibling rivalry orchestrated by the ghost of our father. The settlement took another 2 agonizing months. David was forced to scramble. He couldn't pay $75 million outright, but he also couldn't walk away. His investors, faced with the choice between losing their entire prior investment or securing the water source, begrudgingly agreed to finance the acquisition. We eventually settled on a slightly lower but still astronomical figure of $68 million, structured over a 5-year payout, plus a 2% royalty on every gallon of water sold from the deep source for the next decade. The complexity of the deal was a deliberate final twist. Every time David signed a contract to sell a new house, every time he paid a water bill for his new development, he would be reminded that he was paying his little brother, the one he had tried to dismiss as a simple farmer. The day the final contract was signed, I stood on the dusty rise that used to mark the boundary between our halves. The sun was setting, painting the dry land in shades of gold and burnt orange. David didn't look at me. He looked at the land, now entirely his, but acquired at a price that would keep him leveraged and accountable for years. He had won the land, but I had won the game. I had defended Dad's legacy, not by clinging to the farm, but by realizing the true power of the secret he left me. I took my payment, a vast, unimaginable fortune, and didn't move to the city. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. I took the map, the original parchment, and the journal, and I relocated to a small, quiet farm in a different, wetter valley. I used a fraction of the money to invest in sustainable farming and water conservation education, honoring the true spirit of my father's careful stewardship. I never saw David again, though I received the monthly royalty reports. Every single deposit slip was a reminder that my brother's success was tethered directly to the resource he tried to steal, a resource he only received because I permitted it. That land, the land David developed, is now a sprawling, successful community known for its reliable, crystal-clear water. He became a titan of local industry, known for his foresight and genius. But only I know the full truth, that his empire was built on a well that he was too arrogant to see, and that the map, the real inheritance, remains safely tucked away in my possession. The deep source ensures his success, but my quiet royalty checks ensure my lasting, satisfying triumph. I traded the soil for the security, the dry earth for a flowing river of wealth, all thanks to a secret my brother didn't know I kept. And every morning, when I look out at my own green fields, I remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are not the ones advertised, but the ones buried deep beneath the surface, waiting for the one person patient enough to find them.